It was a Tuesday morning when the order came down. No advance warning, no quiet briefings with congressional leadership, no carefully orchestrated rollout with friendly media outlets getting the story first. Just an executive order, signed, sealed, and delivered to the inbox of every governor in America. And suddenly, the political landscape shifted in a way that caught almost everyone off guard. Now, if you've been paying attention to politics over the past few years, you know that executive orders are nothing new. They're a tool. Sometimes they're consequential. Sometimes they're symbolic. But this one was different. And the reaction from Republican governors told you everything you needed to know about what was really going on beneath the surface. Within minutes of the order's publication, phones started ringing. Not friendly calls, not collaborative conversations between a president and his governors. No, these were urgent calls. The kind of calls that happen when something has fundamentally shifted and nobody quite knows how to respond. Republican governors' offices lit up with activity. Staff members were pulled into emergency meetings. Legal teams were brought in. And across conservative media, the immediate question became, what exactly did the president just do? The order itself was framed in careful, measured language, the kind of language you use when you want to accomplish something significant while maintaining a veneer of procedural legitimacy. It wasn't some radical, sweeping declaration. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make headlines for being obviously controversial. But that's precisely what made it so unsettling to those who understood its implications. Here's what most people didn't realize. The real power of the order wasn't in what it said explicitly. It was in what it enabled. It was in the precedent it set. It was in the machinery it put into motion that would take months, maybe years, to fully play out. And that's why the panic wasn't just political theater. It wasn't just Republicans being alarmist or defensive. The governors understood something that the average American watching cable news might have missed. They understood that this order, once implemented, would reshape the relationship between Washington and the states in ways that couldn't easily be reversed. By noon, Republican governors were huddling with each other. Conference calls were happening. Legal strategies were being discussed. And a simple question was being asked again and again. How do we respond to this? It's a question that would come to define the next several months of American politics. And to understand the answer, you have to understand what the order actually did, and more importantly, why it was designed the way it was. To understand why Republican governors were in panic mode, you have to understand something fundamental about American federalism. States aren't just administrative districts. They're political entities with real power, real authority, real resources. And for decades, particularly under Republican administrations, that power had been fiercely protected, even expanded. The governors understood their leverage. They understood that implementing federal policy at scale requires state cooperation. You can't run America from Washington alone. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The personnel doesn't exist. You need governors. You need state legislatures. You need state agencies carrying out the actual work on the ground. What the executive order did, and this is the part that sent governors scrambling, was attempt to circumvent that traditional negotiation. It didn't ask states to cooperate. It didn't offer incentives. It didn't make a case for partnership. Instead, it created a new federal apparatus that would operate independently of state authority in a domain that states had traditionally controlled. Now, the specific area matters less than the principle. Whether we're talking about healthcare policy, education standards, environmental regulation, or something else entirely, the principle was the same. The order was essentially saying, Washington is taking this back. And if you don't like it, you're going to have to fight us in court. That's where the panic came from. Because here's what governors realized immediately. Litigation is expensive. Litigation is slow. And more importantly, litigation is uncertain. The courts might rule your way, or they might not. And in the meantime, the federal government is already implementing the order. The machinery is already in motion. The money is already flowing in new directions. The regulatory framework is already shifting. By the time you get a favorable court ruling, the political and bureaucratic landscape has changed so fundamentally that winning in court might not actually solve your problem anymore. Republican governors also understood something else. This was a power play. It wasn't being framed that way, of course. The administration was using careful language about efficiency, about federal responsibility, about addressing a national problem. But underneath the rhetoric, it was about power. It was about centralizing authority. It was about demonstrating that Washington, when it wanted to, could make states fall in line. And that terrified governors from both parties, though Republicans were more willing to say it publicly. But there was another layer to the panic. The order had fiscal implications. Governors had budgets built on certain assumptions, certain revenue streams, certain federal-state cost-sharing arrangements. Now, those assumptions were being rewritten. States would have to absorb new costs. States would lose certain revenue sources. The fiscal math of state government was being fundamentally altered, and nobody had consulted with them about it. Nobody had worked through the numbers with state budget directors. Nobody had negotiated transition periods or cushions or anything else. The order just came down, and states were expected to figure it out. That's not how federalism is supposed to work, or at least it wasn't how it had been working, and the governors knew it. Now, here's where the political story gets really interesting, because the panic among governors wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. And if you understand the political machinery that was running in the background, you start to see that this order wasn't just about policy. It was about political strategy. Reports indicate that the administration had been planning this move for months, not in the sense that it was some grand conspiracy, but in the sense that serious people in serious rooms had thought through the mechanics. They'd anticipated the reaction, they'd prepared talking points, they'd lined up legal arguments, they'd briefed allies in Congress, they'd prepared statements for friendly media outlets. What they understood and what the governors were now learning was that executive power, when wielded strategically, can be extraordinarily difficult to counter. An executive order creates facts on the ground. It mobilizes bureaucratic machinery. It shifts resources. It changes the default. Even if a court eventually rules it unconstitutional, by that time, months or years may have passed. Policies may have been implemented. Programs may have been created. Personnel may have been hired. Reversing all of that is exponentially harder than preventing it in the first place. The administration also understood something about Republican governors specifically. Many of them were preoccupied with other issues. Their states had their own problems, their own crises. They had limited political capital, and launching a major legal and political fight against the federal government while also managing state operations and responding to their own constituents was genuinely difficult. Divide and conquer. That's an old political strategy, and in this case, it seemed to be working. But there was more happening beneath the surface. The order was structured in a way that made it legally complex. It wasn't a straightforward assertion of federal authority. It was layered. It involved multiple agencies. It created cascading regulatory requirements. It referenced existing statutes in ways that created ambiguity about exactly how far federal authority could extend. In other words, it was deliberately designed to be difficult to challenge, because legal challenges require clarity. They require definitional precision. If everything is ambiguous, if everything is structured in layers that reference other layers, then the legal path forward becomes murky. And while that legal path is being litigated, the order is being implemented. This is sophisticated political strategy. This is the kind of thing that happens when an administration decides it's going to use every tool in its toolkit not just to accomplish a policy goal, but to fundamentally shift the balance of power between Washington and the states. The governors understood this too. They understood that they weren't just fighting an executive order. They were fighting a deliberate, calculated strategy to expand federal power. And they understood that if this order succeeded, if it wasn't challenged effectively, if courts upheld it, if the implementation proceeded, it would set a precedent. It would establish that the federal government could, in this arena, operate with significantly less constraint than it had before. That precedent would matter for years, maybe decades. But here's what most political commentary missed: the immediate crisis, the panic, the legal challenges, the heated rhetoric that was important. But it wasn't the real story. The real story was about something much larger, something much more consequential. Because what was actually happening was a fundamental renegotiation of American federalism, and not through the normal channels, not through constitutional amendment, not through legislation that required consensus, but through executive action and political pressure. Think about what that means. The structure of American government is built on a particular balance. States have certain powers. The federal government has certain powers. That balance has shifted over the centuries, sometimes toward Washington, sometimes back toward the states. But the mechanisms for shifting that balance, the normal mechanisms, involve the Constitution, legislation, court decisions, gradual evolution of practice and precedent. What the administration was doing was trying to shortcut that process, to shift the balance through executive action, backed up by the machinery of the federal bureaucracy, and then daring states to challenge it in court. If it worked, and there was a real possibility that it could, it would demonstrate that the federal executive had more power than anyone had recently acknowledged. It would show that a president willing to be aggressive, willing to accept the risk of litigation, could reshape the relationship between Washington and the states quite dramatically. Now, that might sound abstract, but the implications were very concrete. Because if the federal government can centralize power in one domain, what prevents it from centralizing power in other domains? If this order succeeded, what's to stop the next president, whether from the same party or the opposite party, from using the same tool to accomplish their own policy goals? Suddenly, state autonomy isn't just a theoretical concept, it's a practical question. How much real power do governors actually have? How much control do states actually have over their own affairs? And here's where it gets even more complex. Because this order didn't just affect Republican-led states, it affected all states. Even Democratic governors were watching this carefully. Even they were concerned about the precedent being set. Even they were worried that if federal power could be concentrated this way in one domain, it could be concentrated in other domains too, domains where they might disagree with the federal government. This is why, beneath the partisan rhetoric, there was a deeper concern. This was about the architecture of American government itself. This was about the distribution of power. This was about what it means for federalism when the federal executive decides to exercise power in ways that states find threatening. Analysts were warning that regardless of the immediate outcome, regardless of whether the order survived legal, challenge the mere attempt to do this, the mere demonstration that it was possible, changed the calculus. It signaled that federal power could be wielded more aggressively. It signaled that state autonomy was more fragile than previously assumed. It signaled that the balance that had been maintained for decades was now in question. And once that realization spreads, once governors understand that their power is more vulnerable, once they understand that the federal government is willing to test the limits of its authority, the entire dynamic of American governance shifts. Trust erodes. Cooperation becomes more transactional. Litigation becomes more frequent. You're not just looking at a crisis moment. You're looking at a recalibration of how American federalism actually works. So, what happens now? That's the question that dominated conversations in governors' mansions and in Washington alike. The path forward, as analysts saw it, broke down into a few possible scenarios. In the most optimistic scenario for Republican governors, the courts would intervene quickly. An injunction would be granted. The order would be blocked while litigation proceeded. And eventually, courts would rule the order unconstitutional or beyond the president's authority. The status quo would be restored. But even in this scenario, something had changed. The line had been tested, the boundaries had been probed, and everyone would know that in the future, this kind of move was possible. In a less favorable scenario, courts would move slowly. They would take time to rule. In that time, the order would be substantially implemented. New bureaucratic structures would be created. New regulations would be issued. New relationships would be formed. And even if courts eventually ruled against the order, reversing it would be enormously complicated. And in the worst-case scenario, at least from the governor's perspective, courts would uphold the order. They would find that the president had the authority to do this, and the precedent would be set. Future presidents, from either party, would know that they could use similar strategies to expand federal power. What was likely to actually happen? Reports from legal experts suggested that the courts would probably move slowly, that the outcome was genuinely uncertain, that reasonable legal analysts disagreed about how this would ultimately be resolved. But here's what was already clear. The political moment had shifted. Republican governors were uniting in ways they hadn't before. Some Democratic governors were expressing concerns too. And the broader question of federal power, a question that had seemed mostly settled in recent decades, was back on the table. The administration, for its part, seemed willing to accept the risk of litigation. It believed in the strength of its legal arguments. It believed that even if it lost in court, the political victory of demonstrating federal authority would be worthwhile. And it believed that the order, regardless of ultimate legal status, would accomplish enough of its policy goals to make the effort worthwhile. In other words, this wasn't about winning in court necessarily. This was about power. This was about shifting the balance. This was about demonstrating that federal authority could be exercised in ways that hadn't been tried in a while. What that means for the future is still being written. The court cases will play out over months and years. The political consequences are still unfolding. And the real impact of this moment, what it means for how American government actually functions, won't be fully understood for some time. But one thing was certain. American federalism had just entered a new phase. The comfortable equilibrium that had existed was being disrupted. And whether you saw that as a necessary recalibration or a dangerous power grab depended largely on which side of the political divide you were on. What was beyond debate was this. Everything that happens next, every executive order, every state response, every court decision, every political negotiation will be colored by what happened here, by the precedent being set, by the power being asserted, by the lines being redrawn. This moment will matter, not just for today's politics, but for how American government actually functions for years to come.